Hey guys, this is another one of the videos that I'm putting together for us to kind of walk through some of the more of the depth that's of what's going on in sort of the culture and the history and the context in the book of John. Now this is another video in kind of a two-part series where I'm talking about the people and the groups that are around in the time that Jesus is doing his ministry and groups that we'll encounter in the book of John. Now, this video, the other video I did, talked about the chief priests and the temple leaders, and then just the normal, everyday kind of different classes of people. In this video, I really want to dig deep into the Pharisees. Now, if you have grown up going to church, you've spent any time in church going through the Gospels, or reading about Paul, the Apostle Paul, you probably have come in contact with the Pharisees. They actually show up quite a bit in the New Testament. They're a really important group of people in that time. We find out just because of how often they're mentioned. They show up in all four Gospels, and in the book of Acts, they still play a role. And then Paul, in his letters, talks about his former life as a Pharisee. Now, unfortunately, the Pharisees have been kind of misrepresented, I think, in a lot of ways. I'm not necessarily defending the Pharisees. I'm not necessarily coming out and saying you've got it all wrong. They're actually the good guys, or they're this misunderstood group of people in the Gospels. That's not true. They definitely form a lot of conflict and opposition to what Jesus is doing in his ministry. But I think we've come to understand them and even use the concept or term Pharisee in a way that is not fair to the group of people who Jesus is actually talking to when we do it when we see him talking to them in the Gospels, particularly in the book of John, which we're going through. So what I want to do is just give you a little bit of a good understanding of probably who the Pharisees were, as best as we can tell. Again, our understanding is fuzzy on this stuff at best, but we do have some clarity from both what we find in Scripture, but then also from some outside sources as well. The Pharisees are not a group of thought police who are going around and trying to convince everybody that the way for them to get to heaven is to just do good works, and if they can work their way to salvation. Okay, that is not what the Pharisees are. That's kind of how we come to view them, and when we apply that to ourselves or other people today, kind of say like a Pharisaical mindset, that's what we mean. And that's not what the first century Pharisees are. That's maybe like a shrunken down version of what the Pharisees are doing, because certainly they do care about what people believe, and they're concerned with some of that stuff. And we find that Jesus' critiques for them heavily critique them on their understanding of their ability to follow Torah or the law, and what that will lead to for them, and what God will do because of their following that. But it's not really put together the right way when we frame it the way that you maybe have heard it before. So, all right, so I'm going to try to explain them as best as we know them, and hopefully this makes sense for you, because I'm going to try to kind of bring it to a kind of a modern day analogy. So, but first, let me just read you a good definition for the Pharisees. The Pharisees are we should see them as like a grassroots political pressure group that is concerned with bringing the purity that is found in the temple out to the rest of the land, and in order to kind of bring about God's action. The Pharisees they look back at the history of Israel and they say, listen, we were at our height when we followed God, when we were obedient to the law, when we kept his covenant, and we broke that. And when we did, that's when everything went bad for us. Now, they're not wrong about that. That is actually the story of the Old Testament. That's a big part of the whole story of the Old Testament. And we talked a lot about that in the book of Daniel. Israel goes into exile. And the Pharisees are saying the problem is that Israel has strayed from the covenant and strayed from what God desires for us as a people. And what we need to do is we need to be really strict about going back to that. And the way that we think we should do that is by looking back at the law and trying to extend that out into all of Israel. And if we do that, God is going to act to liberate us from the Roman oppression, from the circumstances we find ourselves in as a people. And so if you were sort of to reframe that in a modern way, you could say that the Pharisees want to make Israel great again. Okay, you know how we have a whole political party that loves to talk about MAGA, make America great again. This is what Donald Trump talked a lot about in his election. The Pharisees have a similar kind of mindset. If we can go back to the stuff that we were doing in our history, then we're going to flourish again as a people. And that means that we need to really dig into Torah, really figure out what it is that is in the law, and find out what bringing about purity. That's a way that they would have thought about it, is sort of purity that you get in the temple through following the law, which leads to cleanness and uncleanness, sort of extending that out from the life of the temple into the rest of the national Israel. And we're hoping that if we do that, God is going to act to restore us. Now, when I talk about them as like a grassroots political pressure group, I'm saying that they didn't actually have any official power to make any of this happen. And so when we're talking about this group of people, like sort of a movement of the people in a lot of ways, we're comparing them sort of to like the Tea Party, or to like the sort of more like Twitter left-wing side of American politics today. They don't actually have any official power. They're not a part of our government in any way, but they try to influence power over those institutions through building up lots of public support and trying to kind of get their policies across through influencing those who are actually in power. And that's what it seems like the Pharisees are trying to do as well. So, like I said, they're not really an official body or necessarily even teachers, but they did have some people who were sort of part of that movement who were in those roles. They had to work with other groups who did have it. Now, we actually have a couple examples of this in our New Testaments. In the Gospels, the Pharisees, they view Jesus as a problem, and so they work with the Herodians, or work with the chief priests. They kind of come together. These people don't actually like each other that much. The Pharisees would have looked at the chief priests or the Herodians as like the swamp. We got to drain the swamp. We got to get rid of these people. They were like, okay, but we can all agree this Jesus guy is the worst, and we need to get rid of him. And the chief priests are like, yeah, we can agree with that too. Let's work together to try to catch this guy, try to bring him to trial, convince everybody that he's worth killing off so that he doesn't cause us any more trouble. And so they kind of work together to accomplish that. That's not a normal thing for them to do, but it's one way that the Pharisees, if they did want to get their agenda across, that they do it. Another example is in the book of Acts. We have a character named Saul of Tarsus who meets Jesus and changes his name to Paul and becomes the Apostle Paul, like one of the most important people in the whole Bible. But what he does is he's a Pharisee. He's a really zealous Pharisee who gets some official orders from the chief priest to go about and using some of the political authority that the chief priest would have. He's able to go and sort of bring some persecution against the church. But he was only able actually to do that because he was able to convince the chief priest to sort of give him that authority to go do it in the first place. And so you kind of see how this group of people are operating, right? Now, like I said, some of these, just like there are some members of Congress who are Tea Party members, or like the Freedom Caucus is something we talk about, or part of the really progressive left. That's like sort of like they're part of that movement, but then they also hold official power. You did have Pharisees who were like that too. So you would have people who were like a part of really rich families, or the chief priests who also happen to be Pharisees as well. They're kind of their part of being a part of the Pharisee movement influenced their sort of working through like political the political life as well. So we definitely get that in the New Testament as well. But it's important that we understand that they're not necessarily the same thing. It seems like the Pharisees are based in Jerusalem, but they had members all over, and Jesus definitely runs into them, not just in Jerusalem or in the southern part of the region of Judea, but also in the northern part in Galilee. We don't have any idea how many Pharisees there were. We have one mention of how many Pharisees, only one time in any of his sort of historical accounts, so we get a number associated with them. And the first century historian Josephus, where we get a lot of our understanding of the first century, says that there are at least more than 6,000 Pharisees around at the time. 6,000 Pharisees who don't take the oath to follow Caesar. The Pharisees, they're interesting in that there are a couple of schools of them, actually. So we get sort of a more extremist wing of the party, a more zealous wing, and that would be called Hillel, the Hillel group. Sorry, my bad. The Shammai group. And Paul was probably a part of this group of people. And they really want to get rid of the Romans. Like, that's a big thing for them. And so you would find some more sort of insurrectionists, Pharisees, who might be a part of this group. Then there's what we will call maybe the more liberal. They're a little bit more open to other viewpoints. They're not really so upset with overthrowing Rome. They're kind of okay letting the temple chief priests and the Romans kind of do their own thing, and we're going to kind of retreat to a more sort of like scholarly version of Phariseeism, and we're going to really study Torah, and we're going to really try to just say, how can we ourselves and kind of the people that are a part of our version of Phariseeism sort of be the most pure that we possibly can. It's a little bit more academic. And there's a guy named Gamaliel who actually shows up in the book of Acts in chapter 5, and he's a leader of the Hillel group. And what he says, actually, and this kind of shows sort of that more like liberal side to them, is he kind of encounters this new Jesus movement. Again, this is early on in the church's time, and instead of condemning them outright, which we see some Pharisees in the Gospels doing, he says, you know what? Let's see if this is a movement of God, and if it is, then we'll see it grow, and maybe we'll be convinced to join it. And if it's not, it'll peter out and die. People will be able to tell that, and so let's just leave them alone. And so we can kind of see that. And Paul actually says he trained under Gamaliel as well, but he apparently came out on the other side of the coin. He ended up being a little more radical than his teacher. So the Pharisees are not necessarily all bad. There are Pharisees who follow Jesus. Nicodemus is one of them in John chapter 3. They're not necessarily all opposed to Jesus. They care about God coming and working. They actually care about a lot of the same things Jesus does, but Jesus' critique of them is often that they are more concerned with appearances, more concerned with maintaining some of their power and looking good, sort of maintaining the status that they have, that it causes them to reject when God actually does show up in Jesus. The thing that they're waiting for, the thing that they desire so badly, has come upon them in Jesus, and they're more concerned with looking good and more concerned with sort of earning, even if this is not their intent, earning God's favor upon them through how pious they are, through how good of a job that they've done of studying Torah and convincing everyone else to follow this. They're more concerned with that than they are with responding when God actually does show up. And they're upset that when God does show up, it's not through their efforts. It's not through the stuff that they have been trying to do to make God come to them. It's through Jesus showing up on the scene. And Jesus is not, he's not there to fight the Pharisees, but he's not there to, unless the Pharisees deserve it, which they do oftentimes, we find out. But Jesus is not there to get their approval to go do stuff, which it seems like they really desired of him. They really thought that, if you really are from God, then you kind of are going to need our approval to go out and do the stuff you're doing. And Jesus says, that's not true. I don't need your approval. I'm from God. I am the mover. I am God himself showing up to bring about his kingdom, to bring about the stuff you're hoping for. And you've got to get on board with my agenda, not the other way around. And this creates a lot of conflict or tension in the Gospels. So that's the Pharisees. Hopefully that's a helpful way for you to kind of understand who the Pharisees are, what they're doing, why Jesus comes into conflict with them, because like I said, you're going to see a lot of them in the book of John or in other parts of the New Testament if you read through it. So if you found this video helpful and you'd like to learn about another group of people that are operating around the time of Jesus, the chief priests, and we talked a little bit about them in this video, or just the everyday people and kind of how they're structured and the social stratus of the time, I have a video walking through that stuff. If you'd like to learn more about the regions and kind of where some of these people groups are operating out of and the places Jesus goes to, I have a video breaking down those 3 main regions of ancient Palestine. And if you would like to learn more about just the structure of the book of John and when Jesus goes where and when he does what where, I have a video that kind of walks through that quickly, and it'll help aid you as maybe if you read through the book in one sitting. So feel free to check those out as well.